you about a more conceptual project today. This is an interdisciplinary project that also deals with reproducibility and replicability across disciplines. So I think it's only befitting that we did it from different perspectives as researchers as well. And sort of the motivation or the kickstart for our project was that we realized that the definition and implementation of reproducibility and replicability actually really seems to vary widely between different research disciplines and schools of thought, and we wanted to get a bit of a closer look at the status quo of what different disciplines are doing in terms of, I'm going to say R&R because I think the shorthand is much more handy than trying to say reproducibility and replicability right for the next foreseeable 15 minutes. So we wanted to see what different disciplines are doing at the moment, and we went ahead and took a look at data that we got from the Wikimedia Fellowship Free Knowledge. This is a program that funds open scholarship projects, mostly by early career researchers. And it's an interdisciplinary program that's also been long running in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, so mostly German-speaking participants. And they founded over the years 90 projects, like I said, from mostly early career researchers that deal with open scholarship to some degree. And 12 out of these projects explicitly mentioned R&R, and that's what we used as kind of the basis to look at, what are people talking about and thinking about when they address the topics of reproducibility and replicability. So for each of these projects, these 12 projects that explicitly said they had something to do with R&R, we went ahead and we looked at the project materials to determine how they defined and how they talked about what R&R are and how they conceptualized these concepts. And then looked for the challenges to these concepts that they identified and how they were trying to sort of tackle them. And what I'm going to do is to try to talk you through what we found in these materials. So in terms of reproducibility, I'm going to go ahead and start with mostly quantitative research, where in these projects, often reproducibility was defined to mean that you reuse materials and data to recreate the original results. So that is without creating new data. And in the projects that dealt with this topic, the researchers tended to think that quantitative research could achieve reproducibility through something like transparent code and retraceable analysis steps, such as making transparent how pre-processing of raw data takes place or how statistical analysis are done. But they also pointed out that this requires specific tools to document and expertise to use them. And the projects that took part in the scope of this program actually tried to address or sort of help with both of these issues. So what they did was to test the status quo of version control implementation in the social sciences. For instance, one project did that, and they turned out to provide guidelines for reproducible papers and websites. And in doing so, these guidelines were also often accessible, in particular for inexperienced researchers, because they combined code and explanations in one document, and also became sort of adding another dimension of accessibility, became more accessible for non-researchers, communicating results effectively to outsiders who didn't have to do anything with code, but they were able to read what was happening and step by step in these sort of reproducible papers and websites. In the qualitative research area, reproducibility was often conceptualized somewhat differently, more in terms of retracing the path of insight that was originally taken. And this is less specific to specific code or methods of analysis that I am a social scientist myself, that I would be familiar with. But this is more about following the logic that is described by the original investigators. In the projects that try to tackle reproducibility or issues of reproducible scholarship in the qualitative research area, for example, did a case study where they traced instances of an erroneous interpretation of an argument through the literature in art history. So they created a tool which they call citation genealogy analysis. That's an online tool where you can trace basically where a citation comes from. You can change its ancestry, if you will, back through reference sources and see at which point was there a misunderstanding in how a certain argument should be used. And therefore, yeah, this is one way of tackling how people think about logically retracing steps that lead towards a certain argument. In terms of replicability, again, I'm going to start with the quant area and see how they tackle these issues. So in quant, what replicability is often thought to mean is that it involves running a new experiment or a new study of some kind to generate new data using either the same or novel materials. The authors in these projects discuss that there can be close or conceptual replication attempts. So either you try to keep most parameters as similar to the original study as you can, or you deliberately vary some factors that, for instance, because you don't have control over them, or because you are specifically interested in creating a different boundary condition of testing an assumption. And in this body of literature from the Wikimedia Fellowship, there was actually a multi-lab pre-registered replication attempt of a prior study involved, which aimed to test if alternatives to using the generic masculine form in linguistically would encourage participants to think more of women than if only the generic masculine form was used. There was no example of a conceptual replication in this data set, but it was discussed at least that whether it should be this or that type of replication. In applied research, there was also an example from engineering in this data set from Wikimedia. In applied research, we learned that replicability often involves recreating a certain tool that generates new data. And this means that challenges for replicability can stem from whether construction plans for these tools are actually openly available, and whether code to use these tools is openly available, and then whether the output that this measurement tool of whatever kind it is creates, whether this output is standardizable and if results are reported in a standardized manner. And the project that came from engineering and dealt with replicability in this regard, it actually provided the construction drawings, code, and a comprehensive documentation for a tool to measure and work with soil structures, and therefore try to create something like a glass tool for engineering, and tried to also establish kind of a trickle down into standardization of data output and results based on an openly available construction plan. Next, jumping over to qualitative research. Here, we actually didn't find any attempt at replicability because I'm going to discuss in a second, creating new data to assess if the original insights can be obtained again can be particularly tricky in the humanities and in qualitative research. So there, we think we identified two main reasons why that is the case. Because and which actually might be transferable to many other areas of research, but are apparently of greater concern for researchers in the qualitative fields. And one of these concerns is that there are challenges to interpreting particularly the type of data that qualitative researchers work with. So something like interview data, for instance. First of all, it would have to be shareable data in the sense that it would need to be somehow recordable. And in some situations, that's apparently not possible. And then it would also need to be shared, which is, especially if it's very rich data, apparently more difficult to manage in with qualitative data than with the output from Qualtrics that I'm used to working with in quant. So a third point that challenges the interpretability of data is that it needs to be carefully situated in terms of the context, which is a much bigger concern in the humanities and in the social sciences than I have learned it to be as a psychologist. But I honestly think that we can learn something about that, and it makes a lot of sense to be more careful with contextualizing our data. The method of analysis to interpret data would also have to be shared in order to recreate the same steps, which can be difficult if the only method of analysis is, for instance, a researcher's mind thinking through an argument. And all of these steps together need to be based on a shared understanding of all of them in order to approach something like replicability, which makes this term replicability often difficult to use in the qualitative research areas. Second, there are some challenges to the creation of new data, such that, for instance, the data generation process may be outside of the researcher's control. For instance, when a new piece of legislation is passed and its effects are analyzed, and a researcher can't just do that again, but the legislator would have to do that, and therefore it may just not be possible to recreate this type of data. And the second reason is that the context itself might influence the data to a large degree, which might, for instance, take place when time trends are applied. So when a topic is particularly sort of hotly discussed, or it's suddenly not relevant any longer, or characteristics of the sample change over time, then these reasons might preclude new data collections. And these concerns have particularly been raised in the qualitative research area, although I'm sure that many of them also address quantitative data and analysis pipelines. Although we thought that this would kind of be the full scope of what we would be doing, we also saw that projects tended to be interested in prerequisites for reproducibility and replicability. And they talked about these prerequisites, particularly in terms of data availability. So increasing the data availability of well-curated collections of data, be it about archaeological artifacts or data such as from the social surveys. And they also talked about prerequisites for replicability and reproducibility in terms of education. Raising awareness for methods of R&R is crucial for future researchers and can be effective in creating a cultural change. And therefore, this also played an important role in these projects. So to conclude, I'd like to say that overall our analysis basically, and we try to summarize this in this confusing graph, we try to show that R&R is relevant really across scientific disciplines and research disciplines and cultures, no matter if it's the humanities, engineering, life sciences, and so on and so forth. And projects dedicated to advancing R&R actually took demonstrably different approaches, varying from step-by-step reproducibility through code-based transparency to tracing the origin of an argument through publication lines. And although the majority of these projects came from social sciences and psychology, we could see that there was a common understanding that R&R, reproducibility and replicability are important basic tools of research. And there was basically the common goal to advance these, even though the specifics of what it means to do R&R would have to be adapted to the research culture in a specific discipline. So with that, I'd like to end here. And if we have time, give a chance for a bit of a discussion. Thanks so much for having me.